A part of every one of our experiences is to have moments in life that are going to be hard. We know that those hardships are going to come in different shapes and sizes, right? There are some hardships that we get through quickly, but there are other hardships that do linger. They hold on. And regardless of the hardship any of us will ever have to face, a hardship will always bring with it an unwelcomed guest. And that unwelcome guest hangs around. It seems to get in the way of everything. The unwelcome guest that comes with hardship is a fog. The fog makes it very hard to see clearly. The fog prevents the clarity. Perhaps we are blinded by the tears or just simply the choking feeling that comes from this fog. And just sometimes that fog gets thicker and the hardship just seems to get worse. This unwelcomed intrusion into our life, this fog, prevents us from seeing the Lord's hand and seeing his character clearly. Most understandably, all that we can see and all that we can feel is the hurt. Every human being at one level or another can relate to that. But I want to remind you this morning from this most sweet story tucked away in the early section of the Old Testament, tells us about something that we won't always see in the midst of the fog, but it's there. This is summarized by a very precious word. It's the sweetest doctrine in all of theology, and that is the doctrine of divine providence. When we hear the word providence, we are to be reminded of the great biblical truth that God is always working his purpose in every particular, in every place, and in the life of every person. God is always in control, and he always cares. That's what the doctrine of divine providence is all about. God's grand purpose being weaved in through every minute detail in this universe. He is working his sovereign purpose. But when we think of divine providence, we must not only think of divine providence as those occasions where we see something great happen. We'll often rejoice when we see something work to our advantage, and we will testify, wow, the providence of God was on display as things worked out for good in that situation. And that's true. But if divine providence is something that works in every particular, in every place, and in every person, then that means divine providence is also at work in every hard and painful situation. That is why when we talk about divine providence, it's important to understand that divine providence will unfold in two different ways. It's always the one purpose of God that is unfolding, but divine providence will be revealed sometimes in what we could call hard providences. A hard providence is when we are faced with a painful trial and hardship. And as a result, we then enter into the fog of the unknown. It's hard to see God in it. But then there are also what we could call happy providences, where we see the amazing work of God on display in a very clear and obvious way. It's like a blue sky, and you can see it all, and you can praise the Lord with great clarity. But the recognition of hard providence is very important for us to think about. When hardship breaks into our lives, as I said, it brings an unwelcomed fog. It's hard to see past it. And it's most normal and most natural to ask the questions, where is God in this? The moments we have been most hurt, the moments we have felt most alone, the moments we feel like the bottom of life has just been pulled out under us, the moments we don't feel like getting up in the morning because of it, we can't put on a smile to those around us. It does feel like God is absent. God is not there. But the doctrine of divine providence demands that we know that no matter how we are feeling in those moments, God is there. And it's okay that you can't see it because the fog is thick, but He's there. And it's in the midst of a hard providence that we need to look very closely. There's certain details that are very easy for us to miss, but when we gaze at those details, we begin to see the surprising and unexpected work of God, weaving into every situation His purposes, which will bring about the ultimate good for His people, even if we don't know that in the moment or for a very long time. The fact remains that God is working. Well, with that in view, I want to introduce you this morning to the book of Ruth. And what we're going to see in this book is a stunning story. A stunning story that begins in chapter 1 with 2 scenes. And what I want you to see in these 2 scenes is the hand of God unfolding His purposes. But the very first scene in verses 1 to 5 is what we can call an unexpected hard providence. And the second scene, verses 6 to 22, is an unexpected happy providence. But here's the thing about God's providence. It is unexpected. God does things that will surprise us. He works in unexpected ways. And those unexpected ways in which God works sometimes are going to be hard. And sometimes they're going to be happy. But what I want you to see in the midst of it all is this: no matter what providence we must face, whether it be a hard one or a happy one, we need to know that the Lord is always at work. He is always in control, and He is always there because He cares, and He cares deeply for His children. Before we dive into the flow of the story, I want to put this story in its context. Just have a look at the very first verse of this chapter, which really sets the scene for us. It begins by saying, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled." This story is taking place in the times of the judges. What were the times of the judges like? You only have to just look over the page to the very last verse of the book of Judges. Have a peek. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was lawless. It was dark. It was a horrible time to live. Could you imagine living in a society where everyone literally did whatever was right in their own eyes? That'd be a scary time to live. But I want you to note that as dark as it was in those days, that verse actually contains the glimmer of hope. Have a look again at verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Now, at first, that seems to be the explanation for why everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. There was no restraint. There was no restrainer of the people. There was no one holding them back from their wicked ways. And that's true. But that statement is actually designed to help you anticipate the solution to the problem. There is need for a king. And if you jump ahead to the book of 1 Samuel, you learn that God will raise up a king, and from that king will be a descendant who will reign forever and ever and will deal with every injustice. And of course, that is the great descendant of David, the Messiah, the Lord Jesus Christ. So how do we move from a time of darkness where everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes to the hope of a future king who will reign forever and ever? The answer is found in a book that is conveniently located between Judges and 1 Samuel, and it's called Ruth. Also, interestingly enough, in one of the Jewish canons where they ordered the books of the Old Testament a little bit differently to this, you know where they placed the book of Ruth? They placed it immediately after the book of Proverbs. And the reason for that is in Proverbs chapter 31, you read about the virtuous wife. And that Hebrew word for virtuous appears in the book of Ruth, chapter 3 and verse 11, and describes Ruth as a virtuous woman. It was as if these religious leaders were trying to show us that Ruth is that virtuous woman. So wherever it's placed, we know that this book is the solution to the darkest of problems. This book explains why we can go from helplessness to hope, why we can go from darkness to light. It's with that as the background we begin the very first scene, and it's just found in the opening 5 verses, and that is an unexpected hard providence. Look at how this sweet story begins. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. There's the first hard providence that we come across in this book. There's a famine. When we read the book of Leviticus, when we read the law of Moses, it's not a surprise that there was a famine. There was a famine because the people had turned away from God. And this is one of the judgments that God had brought upon the people of Israel. They had turned from him, and as a result, judgment had come. But for the average person seeking to make a living and wanting to feed their family, this is indeed a hard providence. It's a very difficult situation to find yourselves in. Of course, when we hear the word famine, we can be reminded that we live in times where our groceries are going up. We look at the bills that we have to pay now at our local supermarkets and we see that it's going up high. But regardless of how high groceries are going up, our pantries are still pretty much full at home. The shops aren't that far away, and there are some people who even have it Ubered to their own house. So I don't think we can quite relate to how dire this situation was. But I want you to see, first of all, the beginnings of a hard providence. This is the beginnings of a fog starting to set in to this family that we're going to learn about. But then we're told in verse 1 that there was a certain man of Bethlehem. I want you to note that that word Bethlehem appears 4 times in this chapter. The author of Ruth really wants you to know that. He is emphasizing it. If he was audibly narrating it, I think he would be giving a little bit of emphasis every time he mentions the name Bethlehem. The chapter starts with Bethlehem, it ends with Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is mentioned another couple of times in it. So you really need to know that this setting is taking place in Bethlehem. A problem is happening in Bethlehem. Well, this certain man made a decision to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Why is he leaving Bethlehem? Well, interestingly enough, the name Bethlehem means house of bread, and right now there is no bread in Bethlehem. So he thinks that the best thing to do for my family is to move away. I don't really want to get caught up into a lot of the ancient Jewish traditions that tries to apply motive to this man as to why he left. The Jewish traditions are very critical on Elimelech, saying he wasn't trusting God. He was leaving the land of promise. He should not have gone to a pagan land. His motive was ill. It was wrong. Others have suggested that his motive was simply to feed his family. And he was going to a place like men like Abraham had done in the past, where he had left Canaan to go to Egypt, where there would be food. But the reality is the text doesn't even tell us what his motives are. That's not the point of the story. We're not here to raise up and put Elimelech on examination and try to work out the man's motives. All the author wants you to know is that a hard providence had come upon this family. There was a famine. And whether it was a good motive or a bad motive, regardless, Elimelech said, I'm going to take my wife and I'm going to take my boys and we're going to go to a place where there is bread. And they go. As they enter this journey, we are told specifically in verse 2 that this man was named Elimelech, which means God is my king. And the name of his wife was Naomi. Interestingly enough, Naomi is a very nice name for a wife. It literally means sweetie. Elimelech takes his sweetie Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. Again, the author wants you to know that. There was a problem in Bethlehem. They are from Bethlehem, but they are leaving Bethlehem, and they went to the country of Moab and remained there. So what I want you to see at the beginning of this story is a fog is beginning to set in. The fog has come due to something that was unexpected from their perspective. It wasn't planned from their perspective. Their country, their town is experiencing a famine. And as a result of this initial hard providence, this family from the little town of Bethlehem is going to Moab, where they are going to seek some food. But it's at that moment the fog thickens. Have a look at the very next verse. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. This is a devastating moment. Not only have we had to leave our family and friends, not only have we had to leave the town that we loved, but as prospects were looking bright, Elimelech, our leader, our provider, our protector, he's dead. If that hard providence was not hard enough, we read in verse 4 that they, her sons, took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. And interestingly enough, over this time period, they have not been able to have children, and that appears to be another hard providence. A famine, the death of Elimelech, and these sons whose wives have unable to bear children over this last decade. But then we only get to verse 5. Again, notice, only verse 5 in the first chapter. And we read, "Then Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband." Tragedy after tragedy. And we're only up to verse 5. This is a really sad start to a story. But this is an unexpected, hard providence. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that it is a hard providence. Regardless of what Elimelech's motives were, regardless of how devastating this scenario is, being weaved into the midst of this fog, behind this frowning providence is a smiling face. Naomi can't see it yet. It's going to take her a while to look past the fog, but it's there. Something completely unexpected is happening in the midst of this unexpected hard providence. And the very first lesson I want to draw out from these opening verses is this: we will not always understand why a hard providence will happen. And because we won't always understand, we ought not to be quick to tell people why a hard providence may have happened. A very brief word of advice: when somebody goes through a hard providence, love the person, pray with the person, be there with the person, but don't try to interpret their hard providence. Too many people were too quick to do that to this family that they actually knew nothing about in terms of their heart and motive. People are doing the same when it comes to a hard providence that a person will face. But the reality is, we don't actually know why all this happened initially. This family had no idea. This truly was an unexpected hard providence. I can only imagine the questions that Naomi was asking at this point. Oh, if only Elimelech did not decide to leave Bethlehem, I wouldn't have lost him. If only he didn't leave and go to Moab, my sons would have never married these Moabite women and they wouldn't have died. She could have asked all those what ifs, but the fact is, of course, that wouldn't have changed anything. She is in the situation. So as we look at this passage, we are first of all introduced to an unexpected, hard providence. It appears that the frown of God is upon this family. And in the midst of this horrendous time of trauma and grief that is real, that Naomi is facing, she cannot see the hand of God in a sweet way. This is what brings us to the second part and the most lengthy part of this chapter, and that is now an unexpected, happy providence. You see, in the midst of this horrible tragedy, God is doing something. In the midst of this horrible tragedy, it would be natural to ask, is God there? But the answer is, yes, He is. But here's the thing. You have to look really closely. You have to stare at some details that aren't obvious at first glance, but He's there, and He cares, and He's working. So let's now move to the unexpected, happy providence, and that is found in verses 6 to 22. We're told that after such a horrible tragedy, we are introduced to a whole new scene in which we're going to see behind the frowning providence is a smile of sweetness. But in order to see this smile of sweetness, there's 2 areas in this next scene that God displays His happy providence toward Naomi. And it's going to come out in 2 areas, and these are the 2 areas that we most often see the sweetness of God's hand in the midst of hard times. What are they? we're going to see the sweetness of God's providence in some particulars, some details that you would normally ignore. And secondly, we're going to see the sweetness of God's providence in a person. God will often bring various details in our lives that only when we stop and look back, we go, God was doing something. And when we look back, we will often see that God brought a person or people into our life in that moment that brought a sweetness of the Lord's grace into our lives. And we are forgiven when we don't see it in the moment. It is understandable that we don't see it in the moment because the fog is thick. But when we pause and stare closely, we see the fingerprints of a divine hand that is working. You see, when it comes to God's providence, it has to be interpreted differently to how we interpret most things in life. In his famous book, The Mystery of Providence, Puritan author John Flavel said that the providence of God needs to be read like Hebrew letters, backwards. In other words, when you are going through a hard time, you can't make sense of it. But it's only afterwards that you look back, you see, wow, I see the divine footprints in that. I see that God was going before me. God was doing something. And it's only us who have the reader's edge can see that in this story. Naomi couldn't, but she will. So let's look at some of these hints of God's unexpected happy providence. We begin in verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. I want you to notice something that is easy to miss. If you look at verse 6 and verse 22, you see that there is now bread in Bethlehem. It's such a little detail, but boy, it's huge. There's actually a sweetness to it. It's a very small detail that is this smiling face behind the frowning providence. It's as if the Lord is saying to Naomi, I haven't forgotten you. There is a plan in the midst of this pain. She looks at this news as just simply obvious news. There is now bread back in the place where I used to live, so I should go back home. So she makes the decision to go. She goes out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law begin to follow her to make their way back to Bethlehem in order to experience this new life. But then suddenly Naomi realizes what a horrible thing this will be for her new daughters-in-law. Why will this be horrible? Well, firstly, they are outsiders. They are not from the covenant people of God. They were pagan women. They're from Moab. People of Bethlehem don't like the people of Moab. The people of Moab don't like the people of Bethlehem. This is not going to be good for you girls. But secondly, there's no prospects for you back there because of who you are. You are pagan widows. You're not going to be the most eligible girls, as wonderful as you are, because of the customs and the times. This is not going to work out. So Naomi tells them to stop. You have to go home. You have to go back to your mother's house. God has been so good to me through you. He has blessed me through you. You have been wonderful girls. We've got great memories this last 10 years. But really, you need to go back. Girls, do go home. She kissed them, verse 9, and they all lifted up their voices and wept. Can you see that's a very emotional scene? Here these three ladies are in a group hug. They're crying. They're making all sorts of noise and commotion. Naomi has walked with them for these last few years. She's got to know them. They have been good to her. She has been an example to them. A relationship has been formed, but She loves them more than her own preferences and says it's going to be best for you to stay. So stay. Don't come with me. But they push back. Verse 10, surely we will return with you to your people. We're coming. We're going to come with you. But Naomi puts her foot down. Now we're going to see that Naomi is a real go-getter. Wait until we get to chapter 3. She is going to maneuver situations like you wouldn't believe it. She is making you nervous when you read this story, even though you know what's going to happen in the end. But she puts her foot down, and she says to the girls, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say that I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you wait for them till they're grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. What Naomi is referring to here was a Jewish custom, and that is if a son had died and left his wife as a widow, then it was incumbent upon a brother or a relative to step in and to be able to raise up a seed for that woman. But she's making the point that, look, I don't have any more children. And even if it was possible, you're really going to wait around for them to grow up to marry you? I don't want to put you in that situation. I don't want to put you at a disadvantage. Now, it's interesting and not surprising. In the midst of her grief, she has forgotten there is actually a relative. But we're not going to learn about him until next time. But she looks at the immediate and says, I will disadvantage you girls. And I love you so much that I don't want you to be disadvantaged. I have been through a hard providence. I don't know why God brought us here. All I know is God has dealt with us harshly, and we are left with nothing, and I love you, and I want you to stay. So girls, go home. And with that, Naomi is ready to go to Bethlehem. But then we read in verse 14, they lifted up their voices again and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and Ruth clung to her. Ruth wouldn't let go. She was a hugger, but a hugger who wouldn't let go. She looked at Ruth and said, look, your sister-in-law's gone back to her people and to her gods. You go. But then we see that Naomi has a daughter-in-law that also knows how to stick her heels in. She says to her mother-in-law, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from you, following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And then note verse 18. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Naomi stood back and saw the resolve of Ruth and thought, well, I ain't going to mess with her. She wants to come. But not only does she want to come, notice stunningly what Ruth has just done in verses 16 and 17. She has made a public profession of faith saying, Yahweh is my God. I want to worship him. I want to be amongst his people. Yes, I'm an outsider, but I want in. I want to be amongst the covenant people of God. I want to worship God. Naomi, I am going to follow you. I'm going to hold on to you, and I am not going to let you go. You cannot lose me now. I am with you because I am here to serve Yahweh. Even though Ruth also has gone through a hard providence, she's lost her husband. She hasn't had any children yet. And she's in the midst of all this grief. She is now facing the unknown, but she is filled with resolve. Isn't it interesting that Proverbs 31 describes the virtuous wife as this? Proverbs 31 and verse 25, strength and majesty are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. Wow. That was Ruth, a virtuous woman, a godly woman who says, I am going to face this unknown by holding on to Yahweh and letting him take me for this ride. I'm ready, Naomi. Let's go. So with this, they go. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. We then come to their arrival to Bethlehem. It was approximately a week's walk, a decent journey. They finally arrive in verse 19. The two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, is this Naomi? There is this excitement as they see the arrival of Naomi come back to Bethlehem, but the ladies are shocked. They can see the trauma on her face. They can see how much this bitter providence has affected her. Naomi visibly looks different. She's just not aged 10 years. She isn't looking like herself. Is this Naomi? And Naomi, hearing this, says to them, do not call me Naomi. Don't call me sweetie, but call me Mara, meaning bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? What's Naomi saying? Don't call me someone who's sweet, but call me someone who's bitter, because that's what God has done in my life. God has dealt with me bitterly. God has brought a hard providence into my life, and I am now empty. We can understand why she's thinking that way. But let me just make two comments in regards to Naomi's response. First of all, she's right, in part. And secondly, she's wrong, in part. What is she right about? Well, she's right that God had dealt with her in a harsh way. She had lost her husband. She had lost her sons. She had lost all the comforts that she had experienced, and those last 10 years had been traumatic. But isn't it amazing that she's still holding on to God in it? God has dealt bitterly with me. Now, at this point, so many people would be very quick to correct her theology, but that's not a good idea. Because at least she's still holding on to Yahweh, even though she's angry. It's like a lament psalm. How long, O Lord, will you be absent? How long will you be away from me, O God? You don't need to jump in and say to the psalmist, but God's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He's actually here. Why are you asking him why he's omniscient? The psalmist knows that. That's why he's praying to the Lord. The psalmist is just expressing their frustration. And that's what Naomi's doing. She knows the Lord is sovereign. She acknowledged it. But in the midst of her grief, there's something she doesn't quite see. She can't see any sweetness in this. And I understand why. She says that I was full and I've come home empty. But are you really empty, Naomi? Can I read verse 19 again with some emphasis? The author wants you to see this. Now the two of them went until they came back to Bethlehem. And it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. I went away full and I came back empty. But did you? No, that's not going to take away from your hurt and your loss. Yes, that was a real loss, a painful loss, but you haven't actually come back empty. And what Naomi doesn't realize yet is she is going to experience a fullness that no one would have ever expected. Let's look at what continues to happen. We read in the summarizing verse 22, which brings our final lessons all together. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess with her daughter-in-law, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. I want you to see tightly packed in that last verse two signs of God's sweetness that had been spread out through verses 6 to 21. It's this: even though a frowning providence has come upon Naomi, behind it is the sweetness of a smile. And the sweetness of God's smile is seen in two things. First of all, it's seen in a person. God has brought Ruth into her life, and that is going to bring a joy that more than 7 sons could give her. And also, God has brought a little detail that is so easy to ignore, but is so significant. And that detail is, it's now barley harvest in Bethlehem. Ooh, in a narrative, whenever you see something like that, you have to jump out of your socks and be excited, because what the narrative is doing is it's saying as the scene comes to an end, there is actually something going to happen at barley harvest. It is not a coincidence that they've come back right when it's barley harvest. And let me finish all of this by saying that it would have been very easy for Naomi to continue with the view that she was full and came back empty. But what the author wants us to see here is, behind that fog is a sweet smile. And that sweet smile is seen in these two small details: a person and a particular. And what this person and that particular scenario or situation is going to bring about is a sweetness beyond words that is going to result in the most unexpected of outcomes. I want to close by saying it's true from one perspective in grief to say, if only we didn't do this. But let me finish by saying, yes, but if only you didn't make that move, Elimelech wouldn't have died. If only Elimelech had not made that move, Mahlon and Chilion would never have married Orpah and Ruth. And if Elimelech had never made that move and Mahlon and Chilion never married Orpah and Ruth, Naomi would have never had Orpah and Ruth as daughters-in-law. And if that move had never happened, Ruth would have never gone back with Naomi to Bethlehem. And if Elimelech had never made that decision from the beginning, they wouldn't have gone back to Bethlehem when it was barley harvest. And if they didn't go back to Bethlehem when it was barley harvest, Ruth would have never met a man by the name of Boaz. And if Elimelech had never made that decision and Ruth had never met that man Boaz, whose mum, interestingly enough, was Rahab, he would have never shown compassion to an outsider woman and married her, and the two would have never had a child by the name of Obed. And if Elimelech had never made that decision, Obed would have never been born, Obed would have never fathered a son called Jesse, and Jesse would have never fathered a son called David, and we wouldn't have seen the promise through David that there would be a Messiah who would be born in Bethlehem. What a hard providence, but what they couldn't see was behind that frowning providence was a smile of sweetness. It's not for us to know that in the moment, but it is for us to say, Lord, I will trust you.